So first of all, two things. One, my throat is really sore, so I apologize if it sounds that way. And second of all, this time my video is actually scripted. I actually have a script of what to say, so hopefully it sounds better. This opening was not scripted, which is why it sounds so bad. Okay, here we go. Hello everyone, and welcome to the first installment of my new series, From Pixels to Pictures, where we take a look at film adaptations of video games and judge them for how well they adapted the source material. Today we are going to start off this series by taking a look at Super Mario Bros. It's certainly no exaggeration to say that the 1985 game Super Mario Bros. Saved the gaming industry. The game came with the original Nintendo Entertainment System, and after the infamous video game crash of 1983, this game was essential in making the medium of video games come back. The game was revolutionary, iconic, and even to this day, it continues to be a masterpiece of gaming. And it also made a ton of money. By the early 90s, multiple games in the Mario series had come out, and the merchandise was everywhere. There were even multiple television series based off the games, so the idea of making a movie based on the games seemed like an easy moneymaker. The only problem was there was no other video game movies at the time. Well, if you want to get technical, there was a Japanese animated film based on Mario, but it's pretty obscure and Rotten Tomatoes doesn't officially list it, so I won't be looking at that one. Instead, I'll be looking at the 1993 film starring Bob Hoskins, John Leguizamo, and Dennis Hopper. The film came out exactly 25 years ago today, which I swear wasn't planned. It was hated by audiences, torn apart by critics, and it bombed at the box office, making less than half of its budget back. Though to be fair, the fact that it came out 1 week before Jurassic Park certainly didn't help. All these years later, it seems like there are two different kinds of reactions that people have to this movie. They either completely despise it or they consider it to be a guilty pleasure. Personally, I'm in the latter camp. I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this movie, even though it is pretty stupid. But the real question today is, how well did this movie do at adapting the source material? Well, let's find out. This is From Pixels to Pictures, Super Mario Bros. Now, this analysis will have 4 rounds: characters, setting, story, and experience. The first round is characters. As we'll discuss in later rounds, the story in this game is not terribly complicated, and as such, the characters are not terribly complicated either. Mario and Luigi are the heroes, trying to save the princess from a monster, and the monster also has a bunch of smaller monsters working for him. It's interesting to note that in the game, at least in the original Super Mario Bros., Mario and Luigi never actually interact on screen. In fact, if you only play the one-player version, you might never know that Luigi even exists. Playing the two-player version introduces Mario's brother Luigi, who is literally just Mario, just colored differently. And the two brothers aren't really working together, but rather competing to save the princess, which seems a little counterintuitive if you stop to think about it. The filmmakers took an interesting approach to this. The movie could have focused exclusively on Mario, or included Luigi in a small supporting role, but staying true to the title of the game and film, Mario and Luigi are co-leads in the story, working off of each other and ultimately working together to win the day. In the movie, the two brothers are played by Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo, which leads to our first big problem. They're not Italian. I mean, technically they're supposed to be Italian-American, but we don't get any indications of this from their accents or dialogue. But ethnicity aside, the two actors play their parts well, in my opinion. Now, there is a noticeable age difference between the two actors, leading to a number of reviewers mistakenly believing that they're actually father and son, and it's easy to make that mistake due to an early bit of dialogue that is kind of vague. But the reality is Mario is the older and more responsible sibling, and with both of their parents absent for reasons that are never explained, Mario has been looking out and taking care of his younger brother for some time. This is a real-world situation that a lot of people can relate to, and from what I understand, the early draft of the movie was going to focus on their situation a lot more. But the studio executives demanded that any drama about the brothers' backstory be toned down in order to focus on the action. At any rate, Hopkins and Leguizamo do legitimately have chemistry. Sure, we've seen sibling relationships in movies that have been done better, but what we got here wasn't bad. Luigi is the younger, more wild sibling who gets great joy out of life and is always excited to go on an adventure, while Mario is the realist, more cynical older brother who has to keep his younger sibling in check. So, basically they're Sans and Papyrus. Bob Hoskins is, of course, an Academy Award nominated actor, and he's clearly trying his best with material that isn't always the strongest. Meanwhile, John Leguizamo seems like he's just happy to be there. The only real downside is that the character of Mario seems to contradict what little we know of him from the games. Mario in the games is just a lot more cheery and a lot more of a risk-taker than the character Hoskins is playing, but honestly, I can forgive that. The one trap that a lot of video game adaptations tend to fall into is that they have difficulty taking the protagonist, who is often a fairly blank slate character, and making a three-dimensional person out of them. But really, all of the characters in this game are fairly blank slate characters, and Mario doesn't feel one-dimensional next to his supporting cast, which does help the transition. Speaking of the supporting cast, let's talk about them. In the game, we have Princess Peach, or Princess Toadstool as the original game manual describes her. Toadstool, what an attractive name. She doesn't really have much of a personality in the earlier games, and let's face it, even in the later games, she doesn't have a personality. She's basically just there as a prize, someone for the Mario Brothers to save. In the movie, there is no Princess Peach. She's been replaced with Daisy, who in the game series is the name of Luigi's love interest, which is fitting since in this story, Luigi is the one who gets the girl, not Mario. I'll be honest, Daisy is not a terribly interesting character, and Samantha Mathis's performance is one of the weaker ones in the cast. I can see how on paper this could have been interesting. A princess who is returning to the land she belongs in, like Anastasia, except, not as good. Daisy's subplot just doesn't work, partially because it involves some of the movie's stupidest moments. The whole thing with her father being a giant fungus, she takes that way too well. For all that, though, Daisy might not be the most interesting character out there, but when you compare her to Princess Peach, she suddenly comes out looking like a Shakespeare character. I mean, consider this. At the end of the movie during that sequel tease, Daisy is the one preparing to go into action with a loaded gun and everything. It's hinted that if there is going to be a second adventure, Daisy is not going to be the damsel in distress this time, whereas Peach, well, she basically gets kidnapped every other week, and she doesn't even fight back. And then you've got Bowser, or Koopa as the movie calls him, and this represents one of the biggest changes. In the games, Bowser is a straight-up monster, basically a fire-breathing dragon, whereas in the movie, he's Dennis Hopper. Basically, in the world of this movie, there is an alternate dimension where people evolved from lizards instead of apes, and yet they still look exactly like human beings. It's about as stupid as it sounds. The role of Koopa is absolutely awful on paper, but Dennis Hopper's performance is truly something special. He's just having so much fun being deliciously evil, you can almost overlook the fact that his character makes absolutely no sense. There's no exploration into his backstory. All we know is he wants power, even though he seems to already have quite a lot of power, so I don't know why he's complaining. He's just evil for the sake of being evil, with no depth. And don't get me wrong, the Bowser from the games wasn't a very complex character either, but if you're going to go to the trouble of humanizing the villain, you could at least try to humanize the villain. The other characters have all changed so drastically that the only way they're even recognizable as their game counterparts is their names. Toad has gone from the lovable servant of the princess to a rad biker dude who stands up to Koopa and gets turned into a Goomba. Which, by the way, I know everybody talks about the Goombas, but wow, could you be any more different if you tried? Big Bertha went from a giant fish to a bouncer at a nightclub, and I don't have anything to add to that. Ooh, there's Yoshi. To be honest, the effects on him were pretty good for the time, but that doesn't change the fact that he contributes absolutely nothing to the plot. There's also Mario's girlfriend, Daniela. Honestly, the whole time she was on screen, I found myself wishing that she had been named Pauline, which was the name of Mario's first girlfriend from the Donkey Kong era. I mean, come on, they look exactly alike. The last character I'll mention is Lena, Koopa's right-hand woman played by Aunt Petunia. I mean Fiona Shaw. Screw it, let's just call her Aunt Petunia. I don't believe she was inspired by any character from the games, and she didn't do that much plot-wise, but it was cool whenever she went on screen, just because I would be like, oh hi, Aunt Petunia! And that's pretty much it. So while I did like the direction they went with Mario and Luigi, the rest of the cast was fairly unimpressive to say the least. But at the same time, it's not like the characters in the game were that interesting to begin with. Dennis Hopper was very enjoyable as Koopa, but the role is so underwritten that it ultimately didn't work. Overall, I'm in a tight spot. Most of the problems in this movie stem from the story and the setting, not the characters. And a good number of the actors are trying. I think ultimately I'm going to give characters a 5 on the scale. Far from perfect, but given what they had to work with, I guess it's not as bad as it could have been. Our next category is setting, and this is a really important category to consider when comparing video games to movies. One thing that video games are great at is environmental storytelling. Since games allow the player to explore the world at their own leisure, it lets the player truly sink into the world and be a part of the world. As such, game designers go to great lengths to make sure every square inch of their world is a part of the story. And this is where Super Mario Bros. Hits a bit of a stumbling block. I myself wouldn't know how to go about making a film adaptation of this game, especially seeing how there were no other video game movies to compare it to at that time. But if I was the one tasked with bringing this game to life, my first idea would be to set the film in a medieval fantasy setting, something like The Princess Bride. Green hills, blue skies, big castles, and yes, even a fire-breathing dragon. Now, this decision alone might not be enough to save the movie, but it would certainly be a good start. But because this movie was made in the 90s and everything had to be extreme, they changed the film's setting from a fantasy world to a sci-fi world, and it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. Actually, before we even get to that, we should talk about the opening of the movie, which is set in Brooklyn. Brooklyn. I mean, maybe the studio thought that a film set in a far-off land with two Italian leads would not attract a big audience, but starting off your Mario movie in New York is just a really dumb thing to do. If Mario and Luigi are supposed to be Italian Americans, how come they never talk about their home country of Italy? Why instead are they always making references to living in New York? I'll tell you why. Because the studio thought it would be relatable to more people. And once we enter the world of Dino Hatton, yes, really, things get even worse. The directors got David L. Snyder, the production designer of Blade Runner, to work on this film, and I wouldn't be surprised if they just said, hey, remember what you did on Blade Runner? Do literally the exact same thing except put dinosaur puns everywhere. But honestly, changing the setting to sci-fi isn't even my biggest problem. The real issue here is the utter lack of color in this movie. If there's one thing that's present throughout all the Mario games, except the Game Boy ones, it's the amount of color. Color is all over the place. It gives the world a very child-friendly feel that makes it the kind of world you want to live in. The most amount of color we get in this movie is the red and green jumpsuits that Mario and Luigi eventually put on. And even then, they look more like two people cosplaying as Mario and Luigi rather than the actual characters. The rest of the movie is dark and colorless, looking nothing like the games. And maybe the idea was to show Koopa's dominance over the city, but I would have preferred it if they had kept the dark and gray stuff for the inside of Koopa's lair so it stands out from the rest of the locations. In fact, when going over footage, I noticed that the halls in Koopa's lair had spikes that actually seemed reminiscent of something from the Mario games. And no joke, just seeing this small little detail was almost enough for me to change my grade up a bit. But ultimately, I decided against it. If they had changed the setting of this movie from a really confusing sci-fi world to a fantasy world with bright colors, I think many of the film's problems would have been fixed right there. But as it stands, the movie horribly misrepresents the iconic setting of the games. It gets a 1. And now, the story. Usually, when a property transfers from one medium to another, the story is the most important aspect of that translation. But in this series, I have a feeling that story is not going to be the primary focus in most of these video games being adapted, or in the finished films. And I think the same can definitely be said for Super Mario Bros. In the game, the story is just an excuse for the gameplay to happen. In the movie, the story is an excuse for a bunch of really weird, dumb stuff to happen. And so the question becomes, which is worse? Barely having a story at all like the game, or having a bad story like the movie? The Mario games are not known for their stories. I mean, probably the best example of actual storytelling in these games is Rosalina's backstory in Mario Galaxy. So, if you actually look at the story in the first Mario Bros. Game, beat by beat, the movie actually does a pretty good job of following it. A princess gets kidnapped by a monster, and Mario and Luigi set out to defeat the monster, rescue the princess, and save the world. The only thing they really cut is having Mario and Luigi constantly show up at the wrong place and have to be told, your princess is in another castle over and over again. Which, let's be honest, we could have all done without that. Although, personally, I wish that the line, your princess is in another castle, could have been incorporated into the script in some way. I mean, come on guys, it's such an iconic line, you could have been creative. Apart from that, the story of this movie is interesting, to say the least. Because the game really didn't have much of a story, the writers had to make one up of their own. And it's not a very good story. I feel like they tried to incorporate elements from the game into the script, but in all the wrong ways. Specifically, the use of the king as fungus. I guess they felt it was more credible than having giant multicolored mushrooms everywhere, but really the movie's version comes across as much, much stupider. Koopa does at one point use the term Mushroom Kingdom to refer to the city, but I'm pretty sure he's using the term sarcastically. It almost feels like they're making fun of the game sometimes, which is not the way to go about doing an adaptation of anything. And there's also a lot of things that just flat out don't make sense. Koopa's entire motivation throughout the story is to possess the meteorite piece that will allow him to cross dimensions, but why doesn't he just go through the same portal that Iggy and Spike went through to kidnap Daisy? In fact, Mario asks this at one point, and the response is, "Oh, the portal wasn't open until recently." Well, the portal's open now! Take advantage of what you have! And even just the little things in this movie don't add up. Like at the very beginning, when we first introduced to Mario and Luigi, they get a call about a leaky sink. When they arrive at the scene, they find a rival plumber is already there, causing Mario to exclaim, "They beat us again!" So, did this person just call up 2 plumbers to see which one of them would get there first? Furthermore, is this something that happens often? Little things like that really do start to add up after a while, and in all fairness, they do make the movie enjoyable in a so bad it's good kind of way. But at the end of the day, I just didn't buy the story. There were just way too many things that were up in the air. But in all fairness, they do translate the basic plot from the game, and if you change the setting of the story, a lot of the problems would have been fixed or at least smoothed over. But it is hard to defend a weak story, regardless of what they had to go off of. I give it a 3. And finally, the experience. What makes a video game different from any other medium of storytelling is that it is an interactive experience. Other storytelling mediums don't require the audience to do anything other than sit back and take it all in. Well, sometimes theater will get a little interactive, but they can't realistically go very far with it. Clap your hands to make Tinkerbell come back! Guess what? Even if you don't clap your hands, Tinkerbell's coming back. But video games actually allow the player to interact with this world and with these characters. Super Mario Bros. Was revolutionary for its precision platforming gameplay. Even to this day, you can still see the influence of Super Mario Bros. In platforming games. The real challenge of making a film adaptation of a video game is taking the interactive elements from the game and making them still compelling in a non-interactive medium, which can be a very tricky thing to do. After all, it's always more fun to play a video game than to watch somebody else play a video game. So how does this movie try to solve the problem? By my money, they try to make you forget about this problem by adding about a dozen more problems in the form of a convoluted storyline. Now, there are a handful of action scenes in this movie, and you get the sense that they were trying to get a feel for the experience of the games, but they weren't successful at all. Most notably is the rocket boots that Mario and Luigi use at one point to jump high, clearly a throwback to the games, where jumping high is the primary mechanic. This could have been used throughout the entire film for some creative action sequences, but they don't do nearly enough with the idea as they should. There's also a scene where they slide down an enormous pipe. I get the sense that the filmmakers were trying to emulate the games, but they don't do enough with it. I mean, for the pipe scene, all they needed to do was add the famous pipe sound effect, and it would have been a little bit better. Blum, blum, blum. In fact, that leads me to another big problem with this movie, how it really fails in the auditory department. Outside of the lack of recognizable sound effects from the game, there's also a distinct lack of music from the game. Which is weird because Alan Silvestri, one of my favorite composers, worked on this film, but his score is cheesy and forgettable. I wish he could have found a way to reuse some of the classic themes from the Mario games and use them in the score, giving them a grand orchestral feel, but it never happens. The only time any of the music from the game can be heard in the film is at the very beginning. The iconic 8-bit theme from the game can be heard during the opening moments of the film with colorful logos. And as strange as it seems, that opening comes closer to matching the game than any other moment in the rest of the film. Admittedly, I do really like the song Almost Unreal, which plays during the end credits, even though it feels really tonally off from the rest of the movie, let alone the game series. As a whole, this movie just feels confused. I get the sense that this script started out as something completely unrelated to Mario, and then they just changed the character names and added a few Easter eggs. And while I did find the film to be enjoyable in that so bad it's good way, that clearly wasn't what the filmmakers were going for. Truthfully, I don't know what they were going for. I understand that they had to take liberties and that there wasn't much of a story to go off of, and I'm not going to act like I know for sure how to make a film adaptation of Super Mario Bros., but this is definitely not the way to do it. So, on experience, I give it a 1. So, when I put it all together, the 1993 film Super Mario Bros. Gets 10 out of 40. 25%, or, using a common grading scale, F. Super Mario Bros. Might be fun to watch, but not for the reasons the filmmakers intended. It completely misses the point in adapting the source material, and it set the bar pretty low for future video game adaptations. So what do you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and join me next time when I take a look at the 1994 film Double Dragon. See you then.